Okay, good evening, everyone.
Hi.
Welcome. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Prayas, No,
Hi.
Malvika. Welcome to Mapping Fragments Day 3. This is a study group that has been organized as part of Srinagar Biennale's web node and is brought to you by Sufficient. So, in the past couple days, we talked about fragments and maps, obviously. We talked of fragments being acted upon by organizing forces, in particular, yesterday. And we talked about fragments forming patterns. Then we also went into some discussion around concrete ideas of administration and governance and power structures. And we discussed mapping as a survey and mapping as a lens or a filter applied on topographies.
Yeah.
We also went into discussion on maps as distancing agents. And and then the big question we also discussed yesterday was about mapping conflicts. And maybe we can see how things go today, but maybe we can go into some concrete directions today as well. Let's go with the first question and start there, which is, how is fragmentation perceived? So, how is fragmentation perceived? And for me, the first question that arises when I think of this is, who is the perceiver?
Right.
Yeah, so the internal and the external view of fragmented being is different, right? Because the internal experience of a fragmented being is scattered,
Yeah.
whereas the external experience of a fragmented being might never know that this is a fragment.
So the projection of a fragment doesn't necessarily know that it's a fragment. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so from the outside you can never assess whether it's a fragment or it's a pattern, it's a map or whatever.
Right.
But I think internally that this is not a unification of many different islands of energy in that sense.
I mean,
think at the first level of perception, I think I can think of this, in terms of how we perceive people.
Yeah.
So we perceive one another as individuals, but when we start relating to different people, we also relate to, I guess, fragments of them that we can identify within ourselves.
Right.
And that's when we begin to perceive the fragmented nature of every being.
Right. So what you're saying is, what I'm hearing is, there is an element of time and an element of degrees. So
And I think the identification and the building the relation is when a fragment is perceived.
Right.
When there is no connection, it is an individual soul entity. It's only when there are connections made that the connections forge some sort of um, idea of a bond.
So,
I'm thinking even in terms of chemicals and molecules coming together, there's something that bonds them together.
Right, but then to go back to what you just said about perceiving a person, for example, an individual over, when we first meet them, they appear in a particular way, but, after getting to know them, there are other facets that appear. And
Right.
that sounds like, so how is fragmentation perceived? So there are degrees to it. You might perceive from external view, there might be a perception, or even internal. I mean, even when we know ourselves, for example, when we sit with ourselves, we are aware of certain things, but as conditions change, as time inputs change, and uh, in the things that get projected or the things that get perceived of that individual are different. And so there are different
Right.
fragments that are at view.
Yes.
And as time goes by or whatever, as more and more of these pieces are visible, maybe there is this organizing tendency that makes us perceive that there is some sort of a coming together.
Yes. Yes.
So then we map that individual, or are we mapping our perception of that individual perhaps?
I think both are done. A little bit of both, I would.
Right. So it's both happening at the same time. We are
Yeah.
mapping, yeah.
I think the perception in itself is a kind of mapping.
Exactly right. Yeah. That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
So
Perception is
of
mapping.
experience, perception of experience is a kind of mapping. That's what you're saying, Malvika, because so
Yeah. Yeah.
in the sense that our sensory information feeds us fragments which we assemble in the form of the perception of experience.
Say that again. I kind of lost you
No,
there.
so our sensory, uh, the sensory information from multiple sources is
Mm-hmm.
compiled together into this
Right.
thing which is the perception.
Right. And it's
Yes.
interesting
Yes.
because
Yes.
even the sensors themselves are fragmented. The sensors are located at various places and they are taking in fragments of what they are perceiving. And that also is coming together into some kind of a map.
Yeah. It's
Right.
true.
Hmm. And now if we switch to the internal, like Prayas, you were talking about the external and the internal perceptions. So if we switch to the internal, are we talking about perceiving the fragments internally? Then are we talking about perceiving experience, or what are we talking about from the internal perspective?
From the internal perspective is actually from the beginning of the study group has been my interest actually, because
Okay.
irrespective of how we consider a fragmented being to be from the outside, the actual trauma of fragmentation is experienced on the inside. So I actually think it's something that your experience is getting fragmented,
Uh-huh.
right?
Yeah.
Your experience gets fragmented when you are fragmented, and that is painful.
Yeah.
Fragmenting your experiences, so there is a cost you are paying for
Yeah.
for being fragmented.
Yeah.
It's
And
something
it,
Noor is just saying that experience itself is fragmented, and I'm not quite understanding that because my understanding of experience is something that is of the moment. You don't you can experience fragmentation, but can you also know that that very experience is fragmented? I'm not sure because you're just experiencing it, and at that moment of experiencing something, how do you know what it is? The knowing comes after, right?
yeah, I guess in the moment it is like whatever is happening is it. And it's that's it.
Yeah.
We don't know whether it's full or half or I mean,
No, but
if we apply some kind of a logic to it later on, as you said, like then yes, I mean, obviously I'm not going to know the entirety of it, but in the moment it does seem like it is all it is.
no,
Yeah,
but
yeah, that's how
in the
I read
moment
experience.
Prayas, what you say?
in the moment you would know that your experience is fragmented by your concurrent experience of contradictory things. I mean, your concurrent experience of two contradictory perspectives of the same experience, actually.
So you're
Then
talking
you,
about a higher level of awareness in the moment.
I mean, when you come across contradictions
Yeah.
within within yourself.
Does fragmentation always have to be contradictory?
A fragmented experience might not be consisting of only contradictory things, but when the contradiction arises, then you know for sure that there is some fragmentation that has taken place.
But then that awareness that a fragmentation has occurred, does that happen while you're experiencing it, or can it happen? I mean, I would think it would happen if you have a higher level of awareness of the
No,
situation.
it's in any conflict. For example, like we were talking yesterday,
Hmm.
in any and in psychology, let's say desires are of interest, because what you express your desire towards actually uh, is a encoded form of communicating a lot of things. So, if, for example, you dislike somebody, you might be extra polite to them or whatever. I'm just quoting standard
Yeah.
textbook kind of descriptions uh,
As,
of actually of being in a conflicted. Uh,
so
yeah,
you're saying that there is, what you're talking about is being aware ki, okay, I don't like this person, but I have to be polite to them. So there is a sort of cognitive dissonance kind of thing going on, but you're doing it with full awareness. So you're saying that sort of contradiction.
yeah, you might not be doing it in full awareness, but the thing is, you are experiencing the contradiction within yourself. You're experiencing that
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, this is someone I don't like, but this is someone I want to be I also feel like being very polite to.
Correct.
Yes,
But
but
then
that comes from a
the experience of that contradiction is still very whole. I mean, what does it mean to say experiencing fragmentation, or is experience itself fragmented? I'm not phrasing it right. Like, what does it mean to perceive fragmentation?
see, what Prayas is talking about for me is still, like you said, Satya, is a larger awareness of something. Like if I know he's going to speak a sentence now, um, because I know there's a complete sentence coming up, I will
Yeah,
expect more words. But my experience of every word as he narrates them is still a complete thing. So for me, that
exactly.
experience of every word is not fragmented. Only
Precisely.
because I know that there is a larger story coming up, that I will look at it as a fragment. But the experience of every moment for me is not fragmented.
Yeah, and which is very difficult to define as such. Like how the only as biological beings or whatever, we in the moment when we are going through something, it's not possible. I mean, it's very difficult to define it very clearly to be able to express what that fragmentation is really. I'm struggling a lot. I can only see it as a whole, every moment as a whole.
Yeah,
Yeah, I see it
but
that way too.
but when but the conflicts that you experience in
Yeah.
your experience of the whole
Uh-huh.
are signs of something being amiss, actually. So they are signs of things having fragmented without your specific without your awareness.
No, but the fact is that everything is fragmented. Like we don't have a complete awareness, yet we do have a complete awareness. So at the same time, everything is, but at the same time, what I consciously perceive is not going to be everything. It just cannot be because of my limitations as a biological being.
But that is a matter of degrees, right? So the degree to which I can perceive the is
Yeah.
actually
Hmm.
the degree to which I can do that will depend on how uh, how I am fragmented. So in the sense, which are the which are the segments through which I am experiencing the whole.
Correct, that's true. But then, do you have any control on that? How much degree of control do you have on which fragment you're using to sense the fragments?
No, it's not about control, but it's
No,
about
by control, I mean that having a choice. Like, do you have a choice really of how you perceive?
no. I mean, you don't have a choice, but even then, you might be aware of the fact that
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
there are contradictory, conflicting
Yes, yes.
sources of information that I'm
Yeah,
bearing witness to.
definitely. So what I'm hearing is in perception of fragmentation, there are layers, there are fragments already, there are various layers of perception of the fragmentation. Because, as you said, I could be aware that there is a contradiction, but in the moment, I'm not necessarily aware of it. So there's various levels of it.
Yeah, I think this also relates to this idea of distance we spoke about yesterday.
Yeah,
Because when we're talking of degrees, we're also thinking of removing ourselves from that
yes,
moment
yeah,
into another space or time to examine what that moment is. And if
yeah.
we are in fact able to do that simultaneously while experiencing the moment, then yes, I think I get what Prayas is saying, that you can recognize the fragment there.
And yeah, and also distancing can function at various levels. It could be that distancing depends again on the sensor. Like, do you need to be really far away from it in time and place, or can you
Hmm.
actually be in the moment and still be able to distance
Yeah,
yourself? So,
yeah,
in the
yeah,
perception in that sense, yeah. And
yeah.
is that something that can be, developed, or is that something that can be sharpened, for example, that perception?
I think so.
Hmm. Yeah.
Funnily, I think cynicism is can be a good example of that happening when you
Right, right,
see
right. Yeah.
something happening and your mind's also telling you that what's happening is of uh,
To
no
question it.
consequence or
Yeah,
something like
yeah,
that. Yeah,
yeah,
question it at the same time.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, I think what we should be looking at is the conflicts that emerge
Mm-hmm.
within us, which
Yeah,
give us evidence of the fact that we are in fact fragmented.
yeah.
That conflict, what does that conflict do? That conflict also fragments the nature of the scope of our desire, actually, right? So we want multiple things, some of which might not even sit well together.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And that's that's perfectly natural. That's exactly how everyone is. And so Dawn is saying a question here, which is maybe perceiving fragmentation may only occur from a state of non-fragmentation. And this is the opposite of what you're saying, right, Prayas? You were talking about
Yeah.
everyone being in a state of conflict.
No,
We,
I'm saying that you might be in a state of conflict, and I might not be. And so,
right.
in that sense, what Don is saying holds. It makes sense that if you are conflicted and I'm not, then
Hmm.
I might be able to notice that you're conflicted.
That's true. That's true. But then the thing is to say that you are not conflicted. To me, that's questionable. I think everything is conflicted. But there are moments of clarity or whatever it is where that othering, when I have a distance from you, and I'm able to see parts of you which are not visible to you, and in that sense, I'm not conflicted, and I'm able to see the conflict in you.
But
Yeah, yeah.
also I might not be conflicted in the sense that I'm aware
Hmm.
of the conflict. So how I'm propagating my perception of things is with the awareness of the conflicts. So
Yeah.
it doesn't betray a kind of a kind of irrational
Hmm.
uh, uh, kind of perception of which is conflicted and not even aware of its own conflict.
I mean, see, again, to me, everything is degrees. Like everything is degrees. Degrees of conflict, degrees of awareness of conflict. dealing with conflict in while experiencing things. So it's like everything is fragmented. Everything, everywhere I see, everything is fragmented.
That might be your perspective in this.
Precisely.
No,
Yeah.
in the sense that you feel within your perspective, you are able to hold multiple contradictions together.
And what I'm saying is there are degrees to it. Like there are degrees of holding, which might be in me, in you, in everyone. Like there's degrees to everything. And if it's my perspective, then I am sort of distanced from you, and I'm not necessarily able to see what you are seeing, and so I'm kind of alienated from you. And as Don had earlier also said, fragmentation is a kind of alienation. So the perception of fragmentation is a sort of alienation, because everyone is within their own fragment, as it were.
So
And
Kathy brings up something interesting here. She asks, is conflict the same thing as fragmentation?
and that's what, like, the thing is, for me, I'm just saying that conflict is a division. There's a division of sorts. It's a loss of the wholeness. So if I define it that way, then I can say that it's a fragmentation. So she says, I experience conflicts in myself, but not necessarily that these are fragments. And yeah, and the way I'm defining conflict is that I'm not having a coherent sense of the moment or of some event or occurrence, and I'm saying that I'm conflicted here, and I'm calling that as a fragmentation of my whole understanding of whatever it is.
I suppose that fragments sound like something that's broken, or that that there's a shattering there, whereas a conflict, you can have a conflict that feels like the things belong together in some way, or that there is a relation between them that's a necessary relation, whereas a fragment seems like it is sort of self contained in a sense.
So I guess you're saying that not all conflicts are fragments, but
yeah,
some fragments might be conflicted.
Yes, exactly, yes.
So not all conflicts are fragments, but fragments can be conflicted.
Yes.
I see conflict as something that is a result of the interaction between fragments, or the conflict can be as a result of a mapping that may, cause the conflict.
Yeah, like a uncalled for mapping, for example, where some people just don't want to be together in that map. Those fragments don't even want to be there together. They are conflicted. Yeah. I guess it's also terminology. Like I'm using the word fragment the way I'm perceiving it, and I'm looking at conflict as a shattering, as you said, Kathy.
But we need to have certain amount of a common ground, right? In the sense, because we are sharing a vocabulary. So,
but do we necessarily need to? Because it would be interesting to also have conflicting, views on the same term, for example. I mean, does every fragment have to have
I think that kind of dissolves away into the somewhat pointless excuse of being subjective selves.
No, not necessarily. It's if we are talking about fragmentation and we engage in fragmentation of meaning, that would be interesting also at a meta level. So I mean, why does a fragment have to have an identity? Like, why do we have to define it? Which is the next question. What does it mean for a fragment to lose its identity? So what is identity? Like, if we are trying to come to a very specific meaning for what the word fragment means.
Yeah, we cannot do that.
I mean, what does that even mean? Does it have an identity? What does it mean for it to lose it?
So we are saying that all kind of communication itself is impossible because the multiplicity of meanings actually defeats language.
In a way, yes, but isn't it? I think it's amazing that we are all able to communicate despite all that. At a fundamental level, to me, I don't see how anything communicates with anything. Honestly, like everything has its own perception, everything is coming from perspective, everything is coming from its own place, everything has its own meaning based on the individual, and identities are based on individuals.
So there are correspondences that are happening
Yeah.
without our knowledge, like in that sense, without our specific intending those correspondences to happen.
Yes,
We
yes.
and we may intend for the correspondence to happen also. Whether it will happen how we want it or not, I don't know. But
I think communication often is only one component of that.
yeah,
Or wait, I don't know how to put it, but the correspondence is one component of the communication. But basically, what I do think is happening is what we perceive is not necessarily entirely communicated.
yeah, yeah. It is
Um,
entirely coming. Yeah. And to me, again, I see the word fragment there. We are not entirely communicating, which means we are only communicating a fragment.
yes, and when it comes to this idea of identity, I am wondering. I have a question whether it has any relation with the idea of belonging. How are
Right.
we looking at identity? Because if you're looking at the identity of fragments, um, I would think of where the fragment belongs, strangely.
Right, I
How
understand.
do you look at something in complete isolation? Why would identity matter in complete isolation?
Right. And Kathy, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what is identity?
I don't know. In relation to a fragment, I'm struggling. It's so abstract.
Yeah, yeah, I guess we kind of go into these abstract realms because the word fragment itself, and what is it? What is a fragment like? And you know, what is a fragment? What does it represent to you, for example?
It depends on the context. If I'm talking about within myself, that's one thing. If it's if
Uh-huh.
it's spatial, that's a different thing.
Right.
So we are, I mean, across the last 2 days, we have been actually superimposing both together. So the
Right.
fragmentation of the self and fragmentation of the place and of the locality in that sense.
Okay, I missed yesterday. I
Yeah.
listened
So
on Sunday, but I missed yesterday.
we've
Yeah.
been mashing them up, and in that sense, because the mashing up produces a kind of a meaning which can be shared in both contexts.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is we are very much focused on the individual experience. So whatever there are so many definitions, and the idea here is to have everyone's perspective. So even
Yeah.
if there wasn't a thread from the past, like what does a fragment represent to you? For like you just said, there's the internal and there's the external.
Well, I guess this is partly where my question came from because I slightly struggle with it because I feel like I I don't probably I don't think about my experience as fragmented so much as in
Hmm.
negotiation. So I can think about it. It's not coherent in a sort of static sense, but I don't feel it as fragmented as in these parts are not talking to each other. It might be someone used the example, the image on Sunday of a murmuration of birds.
Right,
Hmm.
right,
That resonates with me. That sense of there are patterns that are emerging, disappearing, emerging again,
exactly.
and and that could be spatial or within the self.
Exactly, yeah. I think that was Dawn that had brought that up. Yeah, and I think that's such a beautiful representation of the
Yeah.
mapping as well as patterns as well as the consist con, constituents of the patterns.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Yeah, but then if we focus down, if we zoom in to one of those starlings and we say, what is the what does it mean for the starling to lose its identity?
Hmm.
Is it then going to go its own way? Will it get out of that pack,
But
that swarm?
Wouldn't it be the loss of relationship? I
Yeah,
think, yeah, that if you take it away from any relationship, how
yeah,
would it be
yeah,
have an identity? Yes.
yeah, the identity itself is a fragmented notion because we identify as something only after we are aware of it. So we don't identify with the fragments that we are not aware of within us, right? So we don't actually do a very good job of representing ourselves because we are
Hmm.
only representing ourselves in terms of what we are conscious of.
But you're talking about conscious representation. Like, what if I'm a child and I don't have any awareness, but I know that I am a child. I don't know what that means, but I know that I am. So the identity came before the identification.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, well, I don't know. How does that work?
I don't know how you uh, the identification is again contextual. So I can't
Yes.
look at identity without a context. Like you said with the starlings. Now,
Hmm.
if the starlings is out of its group, I would still see it as a bird. But if I see it outside of being a,
Hmm.
a creature with wings, then so you keep removing every possible identity.
Hmm.
Um, what are you left with?
Right. And what occurs to me is every time it is removed from its context, it finds itself in a new context. So the context defines its identity, as Kathy also mentioned earlier. So it doesn't mean that there is a loss. There is always an identity of some sort which can be imposed on it, perhaps. That's what Nu
Yes,
was also
yes,
saying.
Yeah, but
yeah.
as Nu is saying that identity is not static, and as
Yeah.
multiple we've had that being expressed here. But the fact is that even if identity is not static, our identification of the identity, our articulation of the identity,
Hmm.
is more or less a static narrative that
Yeah.
uh, either loses or grasps
Hmm.
the different kinds of detail at different times. But then the narrative is, I
Hmm.
mean, the narrative is more or less static.
The narrative
That
for
may
that identity.
come from a desire. Yeah, yeah. I feel that may come from this desire for some sort of stability, which we were talking of yesterday, and you want some sort of a continuation from one moment to the next. So you keep um, a narrative that is static, so that it becomes a point of reference to what your identity is or what your
So
identifications
identity
are.
is a
From
map in that sense.
Identity
yes,
is a
to some
map.
extent, yes, yes.
It's a map of the coordinates of that experience.
Yeah, it's a map of uh, the different how differently I know my different fragments.
How differently you know your different fragments depending on the context.
Yeah.
Hmm. So, what does it even? I mean, does this question even make any sense then? What does it mean for a fragment to lose its identity? I mean, to me, this question is not making sense because an identity can never be lost. There's always going to be a map of those coordinates.
No, identity can easily be lost if a
Hmm.
if what I, for example, if what I have been perceiving as being me,
Yeah.
being myself in a very central way,
Hmm.
and then I realize that it's just a fragment of uh, who I am, and not really, it doesn't really occupy any centrality.
But we just said that identity is dependent on the context. So even if that context is gone, there is a new context. So there is another identity. I mean,
I think there
can
are
a
moments when there is complete loss of identity. I think it could be a momentary experience, or it could be temporary or short-lived. But I think it's possible. And I was thinking of um, the experience of, say, when someone is ostracized.
Mhm.
What happens at that moment of alienation? How does one look at identity in those
Right.
moments of sudden alienation?
Does that mean, for example, does that mean they have a new identity, or are we a multiplicity of identities all at the same time, and one is taken away, there is another one still there?
But I think it takes time for that reckoning to happen, where you come to terms with one identity
Hmm.
being lost. You know, that moment of loss is still a moment that you have to reckon with.
Um, but then, isn't there a base identity? Like, no matter what, there is a baseline.
I
There
think
is, there is.
there might be a base identity in terms of what I am externally perceived as, but
Yeah,
But
internally I might really be really vacuous. I might really be.
yeah.
but
Uh,
what is external? Even within the internal, there is an external. When I am self-perceiving, I'm still othering myself and looking at myself. Am I not?
If you lost that, you would get ill, wouldn't you? I mean, no, I'm
Yeah.
serious. That is mental illness, isn't it?
Or
Where
is it
that
a is it an awareness? Is it a higher state?
where there is that in mental illness, maybe.
Yeah.
I don't know, but how would one live with that degree of fragmentation as a because I think it's true that if you lose all your bearings, all your coordinates, there is a loss of identity. But to avoid a complete breakdown at that
Hmm.
moment, probably something is sustained. There are some patterns that are recognizable still,
Yeah.
and if there aren't, then you're in crisis. And
Unless you're in such a state where you've deliberately shed those layers, and you brought yourself to a sort of a base place.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's possible to be in crisis, as Kathy said,
Hmm.
and to accept that one is in crisis, and that is one's identity. That I am at this point in crisis,
Right.
uh, and I don't really have anything to hold on to. I don't really have any
Hmm.
definitive in my identity,
Hmm.
and that itself can form a part of
Another identity.
at least a basis for an identity that allows me to continue to operate as I did
Exactly.
before,
Yeah.
just
Because it's a
with
narrative, right?
yeah, just with a weaker commitment. That in the sense
Yeah,
that
yeah.
I'll go on doing what I'm doing, but I'm not really
Mhm.
sure if I really want to do this.
Yeah, and there's an acceptance that I don't know, but I'm going to do this just because it's the base place where I have reached, and I'm just going to keep carrying on. Maybe something might dawn upon me, and I might have some new information that I might create a new narrative. I'm
Yeah,
just
that's
I'm
possible.
I'm just trying
Yeah.
to I'm talking when I see lose its identity. What does it mean for a fragment to lose its identity? It doesn't always have to be crisis, is what I'm trying to say. It's like, yes, crisis is absolutely, yeah, it's there, but there is also the situation where losing identity could be a good thing in the sense of, you know,
It could be a moment
uncovering.
of transition.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it could be like an
Yeah,
uncovering of new layers which
true,
may not have been
true.
accessible.
yeah,
No,
Yeah,
so
it doesn't always have to be a crisis.
Yeah, yeah.
it's always a crisis actually if you are going to hold
Hmm.
yourself up against any normative idea of
Okay.
what should be and what should not be.
Right.
But I think if you don't do that, you're free to accept anything that you might be experiencing and be okay with that.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and be okay with that. That's the thing. I mean, you are taking yourself out of boxes and expectations, and you have found yourself in a new place. I mean, maybe it doesn't even matter that do I have an identity? Am I able to articulate it? It doesn't even matter anymore.
I mean, the fact is that you do have an identity, right? You're not a blank wall.
You might have
Even
an
the black
identity,
ball
but it
has an
doesn't
identity.
matter. Exactly. That's what I'm saying. There is always a base state. Whatever it is, you change the context,
Yeah,
you
well,
come to a new
I think
context.
somewhere, wait, I think Nu pointed out that identity is momentary, there's only awareness, and I think I'd agree there that it's that awareness of the identity that can sometimes you lose that awareness of your identity, even your base identity. Yeah, you may just about think you're human at some point of crisis, even if everything else is gone.
Right.
But
And the
that
identity
awareness
doesn't matter.
sometimes, yeah, but I think the understanding of what one's identity is and that sense of belonging, when it's taken away, that moment where you feel that loss can sometimes
Hmm.
be a state where you do feel like you don't know
Hmm.
who you
Yeah.
are anymore, or you don't know what
There's an
where you
unmooring.
what you
Yeah.
belong. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, so
And then, as you said, it's a transition point because that crisis
yeah,
is bringing you to a new place where you are getting new information.
yeah.
Yeah, but as
Right.
I think it's being what we're talking about is also slightly going off the the terrain of what we have been talking about so far, because as what Kathy is saying, that it's about that a loss of identity can also seem to mean a loss of memory, which is which I don't think is we what we were pointing towards, because
How is
a loss of memory is an ailment, and we're not really talking about a loss of
I
I
was
was
memory,
just
are we?
I was responding to the point
I know.
in the discussion. People don't cease to exist post total memory loss. Life goes on.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is
Mm-hmm.
in the comments.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
But then what is myself, right? Like, see, that's the thing. I mean, does it matter if the memory is lost? It doesn't matter, like, there is still an identity of some sort. So, I
Yeah.
mean, I personally, I think I might have come up with this question, but I don't agree with it anymore. So then, because of that, let's move on to the next question, which is how do you map yourself? How do
Um,
you, and I guess this is coming, it sort of flows from the earlier place where we are talking
yeah.
about looking at ourselves, right?
Right.
But to map oneself, one would need to be aware of all the paths one is trying to map.
Not all. I mean, at different points of time, you're putting together different pieces. Like Satya was talking of the jigsaw that day. Um, there are different pictures that emerge at different points of time, depending on which fragments you're mapping.
Right. So there, again, it's the contexts and the perspectives of what what sliver of our data are we looking at, and that's one type of map. And we also talked about how there are different types of maps today. We talked about how mapping can be just a survey of the topography, and at the same time, it can also be an imposition of a political viewpoint over a geographical area, for example. And
Yeah, and I think we ended at an interesting point yesterday where we were looking at the whole process of mapping going beyond
hmm,
something that is geographical
right, exactly,
and whether uh, parallel maps could coexist alongside
exactly,
the geographical.
exactly. And if we directly apply that to the mapping of the self in a
Yeah,
similar
yeah.
way, like so, if I'm just stating that this is what I am, uh,
Hmm.
externally, for example, I have this color skin and I have this features or whatever, that's sort of like a survey.
Hmm.
I mean, this is a very like crass and basic way of saying this is how I map myself. But how do we look? How do we think of which rationale to go with when we map ourselves?
I think we can connect this to a little bit to this what we were talking of previously in terms of identity. That's one way of mapping because you're trying
But
to
it also depends on our need of the moment, right? So in the
Yeah.
sense,
right.
our desires will actually map our ourself in the context that we need it to. So what we want, as in what our desire is
Hmm.
going to map ourselves in that map ourselves in that context.
So you're saying that depending on my desires at the moment, I'm going to have a certain way of mapping myself.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And when these desires are conflicted, as we if you can just go back to that for a moment,
Yeah.
then we are mapping ourselves in a very complex way, which might not be entirely aligned in the same set of coordinates. So you can end up making a map that is discordant in in
Hmm.
in itself, which doesn't have any coherence.
Right, right. And there's always the danger of holding on to such a map and then basing that as the, basis for future action or placing oneself into circumstances in the future. So if there is a flaw in that mapping
I
because of
think
that
the
conflict,
problem lies in making maps static. The moment maps become
yeah,
static, then you've got a lot to deal with.
that's true. That's true. And yeah, and that's the problem. Like we might stick with our comfort zone, which is a sort of a map in a way. And if that becomes
Yeah,
static, it's like, I've solidified my conditions and I don't want to get out of these coordinates. What Dawn is saying is sometimes we don't need a clear rationale or something not in conflict with it. A process of mapping can just be something enough for
for a
the
hangover.
process of mapping is what helps to get to the next level, perhaps.
But the moment we think about levels,
Mm-hmm.
we kind of invalidate the fact that
Hmm.
you know we don't necessarily all of us want to be aligned to the same logic of levels.
Which is true, yes. Yeah.
I think of it almost like on any given day, I might have like a little sketch map for myself that's kind of
Mm-hmm.
provisional
Yeah,
for that day on the back of an envelope, and the next day I might cross it all out and
Right.
it'll be different. I mean, not a literal map of a street, but
Yeah.
that it could be a provisional scrawled thing
Hmm.
just for now to get me through the day.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and that's actually an interesting thing. What's occurring to me is what if we go in the direction of how would we specifically map ourselves? Like what, very concretely, like you said, Kathy, you might have a map for yourself for a day. What would that involve? What does it look like? I mean, would it involve what one wears that day, or how one is going to project oneself that day, or what is that map? What does it have in it?
Oh, for sure, it starts with getting dressed. Yeah. Yeah. Uh,
That's interesting because dressing oneself, because that's how do we want to be perceived,
mm,
right? So how can the word mapping? How can we look at the concept of mapping to
But
the projection aspect?
the concept of mapping seems to also betray a kind of strategic mindedness. And
Yeah.
actually, when you're in conflict, you might not have any strategy.
yeah.
It depends, right? Like, if your strategy could be, I have a gun and I'm going to shoot, but you can't necessarily control what
Your
happens.
Or
strategy,
your strategy could be to survive and resolve the conflict. You will find,
Yeah,
look,
correct. Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, so for me, dressing could be like I dress myself with the schedule for the day.
Right. It's going to rain or it's
You
going to
know,
be cold, so I have to wear the sweater.
no, or I plan my day with XYZ activities to uh, give even myself a projection that this is who I am for today, and because I will be defined by what I do.
Yeah.
And so that's a sort of a mapping.
no, but
Yeah.
our map and what Malvika said actually betrays a lot of hope, and it betrays a. So in the sense, when you experience yourself as a set of conflicted fragments, then you might actually be not you might not be motivated enough to do anything but
Yeah,
resign yourself to the fragments.
to the
And
fragmentation.
yeah, and that doesn't leave you in a place where you're going to actually do any kind of mapping at all. You're just going
Yeah.
to be a disarray.
No, I think it depends on the degree of conflict because if even in the most conflicted situations, you have to do something, and you can accept your fragments and say, okay, I'm going to take fragment B, X, and Y today and be that and do these things, and I may convince myself that I'll deal with the other fragments tomorrow.
Yeah.
But there is still a strategy, and that's where I think what you were asking about, having a strategy to um, uh, approach the whole mapping process uh, is also important.
Yeah, I'm just not sure if that choice of X, Y, and Z, and of whatever strategy is something that happens all the time, because I don't think one's conflicted nature allows oneself to make any sort of choices. Sometimes it's just paralysis. It's a paralysis of sorts, which I mean, your fragments have cancelled each other out or whatever, but you are at that moment paralyzed, and a paralyzed identity is what you map then.
True, and you could be making the choice also of that moment to remain in paralysis by not doing anything. That is a sort of a choice. It might be a conscious choice, it could be an unconscious choice, but you might just be there in that state of paralysis.
But how long would you do that?
Right, until something happens. So I'm saying it could be a strategy, it is still a strategy to remain in that paralysis, consciously or unconsciously.
Yeah, because it might be getting you something.
Yeah, in that moment you are okay. That's the only thing that's making sense, to be in that paralysis. Or it's not making sense at all, but you don't know what to do, and that's the only thing that can be done.
And sometimes
Right.
you might be mapped by other people too.
Yeah, yeah,
So, you know, there are times when you feel yourself to be put in a set of coordinates that you don't recognize,
yeah,
and then you can either go with that or literally move out of that, sometimes just by simply moving to a different position, literally spatially, that can
yeah,
change that.
yeah. And if one were to directly apply this to a geographical situation, to larger bodies, I mean, I can see a direct parallel where, you know, a nation state being defined in a particular way. Of course, a nation state cannot move geographically, but, you know, conceptually it can move, and the way it is construed or the way its identity is constructed or the way it's mapped, it changes.
What Kathy was saying about being mapped by someone else, actually, that is being mapped by someone else also gives us the um, opportunity to actually manipulate that mapping, and so because it's someone else who's mapping us, we can manipulate uh, that person or that situation to seem like something we are not.
Yeah. So we are talking about manipulation of one's presence, of one's.
Manipulation of others, other how someone else might construe our presence.
Yeah, yeah. So we are mapping ourselves in a way that manipulates how we appear.
Yeah, and that is, I think, simpler to do than doing anything with our own self mapping, actually, because that is not something which we can that's not something which we can manipulate. Like we can't
What?
manipulate our own truth, but we can manipulate someone else's version of our truth.
Wait. We cannot manipulate. We can manipulate someone else's version of our truth.
Yeah, we can manipulate someone else's version of
Okay.
our truth, but not our own version of our truth.
You don't think that we can manipulate that?
No, I don't think so. I don't think we can actually manipulate ourselves.
But are we fully aware of how we manipulate ourselves?
I don't think we can.
Why the
Yeah.
word manipulate? I'm a little confused.
No, it's in the sense that when we get into the identification of others of us, right? Then I was just commenting, yeah. So that identification is something which we can toy with.
Yeah, I mean you can contribute to that narrative, I think. Uh, but I don't see how the manipulation of the self comes in there.
Yeah, as
So the
in,
mapping,
Because
but manipulation, is it a parallel word for mapping? Is manipulating the
yeah,
self
yeah,
is
yeah,
similar
yeah,
to mapping self? Yeah.
yeah.
Um, there's a parallel discussion going on in the chat window, which is distracting me at the moment. But and it's a pretty intense discussion on, you know, how one is perceived, how, which is sort of, if we were to use the word
it relates
map,
to what,
yeah,
yeah, because yeah.
yeah, pretty much, yeah. But we are almost at the end of our time now, and I think we have mostly discussed today, you know, on how the self is. Yesterday we were more concrete on geographies and conflict and governance, etc. But today we really focused a lot on the self.
Right.
And I guess we had a whole bunch of different ideas coming through. And I guess we can end on this note of, it's a slightly fragmented note, I guess, to me at least, the way I'm defining fragmentation.
Yeah.
And
I'll have a listen to yesterday's. Is it still going to be up?
yes, it is. It's,
Yes,
yeah.
you can access them on YouTube at any point of time.
Great.
Yes, I can send you a link if you like. But thanks everyone for joining. And as
Thank you.
always, there's a lot to think about. And hope to catch you in another study group. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.